So hello, I'm Adrian Randolph, Dean of Northwestern's Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to this fourth in our series of virtual conversations with faculty members for our Weinberg College supporters. This series is meant to deliver updates on cutting-edge research from faculty experts at Weinberg College to you, our leadership supporters. As individuals that have invested in our community, we hope very much that you've been enjoying this thought-provoking series of conversations with some of our most interesting faculty members and hearing about varied perspectives on the pandemic and other issues facing our society today. Before we get started with Professor Papachristos, a few practical matters. First, if you have any technical difficulties during this talk, please use the chat function. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, or should, a chat function. If you have questions of how to connect or there's something wrong, there are people at the end of that chat who can help you. Second, we will be taking questions for about the last 10 to 15 minutes today. So please submit those, not through chat, but through the Q&A function. That's slightly different in this presentation mode of Zoom, but if you put your questions into Q&A, I will try very hard to get to them at the end. So finally, these and other past conversations are available on YouTube, so they will be recorded. And if you don't want to be recorded, please know that, but these are recorded. And we will circulate links to those YouTube videos after this event. So let me turn now my attention to the topic at hand. Today, we're going to hear from one of our top sociologists at Northwestern, Professor Andy Papachristos. Professor Papachristos is a leading expert in sociology and criminology. He works in areas of vital importance nationally and locally, namely gun violence, policing, and the interaction with those with the social fabric of neighborhoods. When we hired Professor Papachristos from Yale in 2018, I remember being struck in particular by one of the findings of his data-driven research, applying the tools of what's known as network science, something we'll hear more about. That individuals linked to those who were arrested were 900% as likely to be the victims of gun violence in the future. What this means, and what I think one conclusion you can draw from this, is that we can identify the likelihood of individuals being victims of gun violence, and with the right strategies, flatten the devastating curve that leads to the needless deaths of so many. I need hardly point out that this is a pressing issue for us in the Chicago area, but also many, many cities that Professor Papachristos works on. But as a native of Chicago, I believe Andy's deeply invested in trying not only to advance his research through the Northwestern Neighborhood Network Initiative, about which we'll hear more, but also through his work with local organizations and indeed municipal government to help bring his scholarship to bear on some of the most pressing problems in especially our cities. So Andy, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get started. I really would like to hear a little bit more about the work you do as a sociologist and as director of the new Northwestern Neighborhood Network Initiative.
So Adrian, just one more time, let me say thank you for having me, and thanks for all the alum and sort of Weinberg leadership and supporters for having me here. And in fact, supporting this work since day one, actually probably before day one, to helping me transition everything over to Chicago and Evanston. And I'm going to be saying the phrase a lot, the Northwestern Neighborhood and Network Initiative. We just go by N3 for short. So I can save a few words and not stutter over myself. So as you kind of already mentioned, the core of my work as a social scientist focuses on cities, and specifically how the different institutions and neighborhoods and groups and individuals, how they're connected and how that gives the cities their character. And also how cities get things done. At the core of this work is this idea of network science. And so I think everyone is familiar with this idea that your connections, your social networks matter. They affect what you feel, think, and do. They affect who you vote for. They affect what sorts of jobs you get. They affect your peers, your romantic partners. They also impact the spread of information and the spread of disease. And I think especially now with COVID, more and more people are becoming familiar with this idea of how networks matter. The idea of contact tracing is literally mapping someone's social network to try to understand how this disease will spread. And that basic idea is captured in a bunch of different branches of science. And so there are mathematical models, statistical properties that we understand about networks. And at M3 and in my career, what we try to do is we try to apply that to these ideas around public safety, around gun violence, around street gangs, around policing. And since I've been here since 2018, we've launched M3 and we have several big projects, 3 of which really are the foundation of our work. The first is we're just completing an evaluation on a new neighborhood policing initiative in Chicago, sort of a pilot program that was just announced as recently expanding. The second is we're also looking at police misconduct and violence and how this has network properties and how that affects officers' bad behavior. And also probably the core of our work right now is looking at issues pertaining to gun violence and how the properties of social networks affects essentially who gets shot and potentially what we can do about it.
So many of those things are on our minds right now when we read the newspaper and we hear the news. It's so great to hear that you're engaging with them. You touched on a couple of issues at the center of your work on gun violence and policing. Can you start by telling us a little bit more about your studies on gun violence and what you, through your network science, have sort of discovered?
Thanks, Adrian. So I'm going to share some slides with everyone. And so I've been working on this issue around networks and gun violence for almost a decade now. And we have a series of papers that kind of lay out some of the core findings. And so if you bear with me while I share my screen, I will walk through some of these key findings. And so I think when you hear about the levels of gun violence in Chicago or in most cities, you often hear this phrase, gun violence epidemic. You hear people referring to it as an epidemic. And the traditional academic response, especially in public health or sociology, are to talk about risk factors. And so anybody who reads the newspapers or kind of looks at some of the health or research, science research in this area, we tend to know that violence concentrates in particular places. And so in a map of Chicago, the west side and the south side have the greatest concentration of gun violence. They also have the greatest concentration of other risk factors: poverty, lack of access to healthcare, lead pipes and in the buildings. So all these sorts of risk factors tend to concentrate in space. They also tend to concentrate in particular parts of the population, especially young Black men. And young Black men in this country have levels of risk of being a gunshot victim exponentially higher than their white and Hispanic counterparts. And one of the things here, understanding these population level risk factors, it can help us understand, where we can direct attention to try to help lower rates of violence. But what it often can't tell us is the answer to this question, which is who gets shot. So which particular, say, young Black male on the west side of Chicago is most likely to be the victim of a gunshot injury? And this is where my colleagues and I believe that network science can have an immediate application, not only for understanding sort of the implications for science, but also for intervention and prevention work. So if we think about this idea of gun violence as an epidemic, the question you have to ask yourself if you were an epidemiologist is, what sort of epidemic is it? Is it actually true that gun violence spreads like COVID or a cold, where it's a sort of an airborne pathogen? It's actually not. We know from even before our research that actually gun violence is actually spread much more like a behavioral, much more like a bloodborne pathogen, quite literally. That there are certain properties of gun violence and crime more generally that affect how it spreads. And you have to understand those things to really do something about it. So crime and delinquency more generally occurs in groups, and groups can exacerbate these things. There's these ideas around peer influence. So the number one reason people carry guns, doesn't matter where you live, is for protection. And if your friends make you feel safe or your friends make you feel unsafe, there's this sort of dynamic that plays out within groups. In Chicago and in a lot of cities, groups and gangs can drive sort of the motivations or the contexts in which gun violence unfolds. And last but not least, guns are durable, right? You can't get shot without a gun presence. Guns can get borrowed, bartered, stolen, passed along. And so there's something about the physicality of guns which matters when we're talking about gun violence. And so what my colleagues and I have done, and we've done this in about a dozen or so US cities, not just Chicago, is we've looked at things like arrest records, right? So if Adrian and I are involved in an activity that led to an arrest, Adrian and I have a tie, right? And so in cities like Chicago, which I'm going to show you, we take millions and millions of records and we recreate these behavioral networks around individuals, right? To build at least some essence of their immediate social networks. Who are they hanging around? And more specifically, who are they doing things that might be considered risky? Again, this is the same sort of science and approach we use to studying the HIV epidemic or needle sharing or sexual networks, this idea that transmission happens through behavior and that networks matter. Again, if you're doing this in your head around COVID, this is exactly what's going on sort of in the science of contact tracing. And so we found a few key things. I'm going to talk about three of them for the moment. The first is that gun violence concentrates in networks. And Adrian, this was sort of what you alluded to in sort of the risk of gunshot injury. And so I'm going to start with a different city, Boston, not Chicago, because it can read this a little bit more easily. And I'm going to do this a little bit slowly just so people's eyes can adjust to looking at these sorts of figures. But in this figure, every single one of those dots is an individual person. It's a human. It's a person. It's not a statistic. It's not a bucket of risk factors. It is an individual who has a name, who lives somewhere, who has family. And in this case, they live in one of a handful of Boston neighborhoods. And each one of those ties is one of those co-arrest ties that I gave example of Adrian and I, right? The red dots are the gunshot victims, right? And if you're looking at this figure, what you should see is that those red dots hang together. There are 2, 3, 4, 5. They clump together, in the social space. And there are parts of this network that don't have any, and there are parts of the network that have multiple gunshot injuries happening within there. And this particular study, we captured about 85% of the gunshot injuries in this community, and it was about 6% of this community's population. So almost all of the gunshot injuries and a small percentage of this area's individuals, the people that live in this community. And what we did for this part of Boston, we've done for the entire city of Chicago. And although this looks like a big glob, you can kind of see the clustering of red images, the sort of concentration of gunshot injuries. And in fact, we see the same properties here that we saw in Boston, which is almost all of these shootings are happening in these networks, which we can measure, which we can look at, and which we could potentially leverage for intervention. The second thing we found is that exposure matters. Again, taking this epidemiological idea. So if you look at the person at the center of this figure, and this is a real life network, by the way, I've just characterized it to kind of zoom in. The red indicate people who are gunshot victims. And the person at the center, 40% of their associates have been the victim of a gunshot injury. 40%, that is ridiculously high. And one of the things we found, and here this comes from another one of our published studies, but going from the bottom of your screen from 0 to 1, that's asking how many of your friends have been injured. 0 meaning none, 1 meaning all of them. And then going from top to bottom from 0 to 50%, a coin toss. And at baseline, young Black gang members in Chicago have about an 11% chance of being the victim of a gunshot injury. And it goes all the way up to nearly 40%, depending on where their exposure is. But exposure matters a tremendous amount. The third finding we have is that gun violence is literally contagious, not metaphorically. It actually moves through networks in time and space in much the way that other infectious disease move. And in one of our studies that came out in JAMA a few years back, we traced these cascades. And here are 3 examples of these cascades that occurred at different points throughout. And then you can see started with 1 shooting, led to 2 more, and 3 more, and 3 more, and 1 more, and so on, and so on, and so on. And these are just 3 examples, but almost 2/3 of all shootings that happen in Chicago happen in one of these chains. So a shooting that happens today is not isolated. It's more likely than not part of one of these chains. And in fact, the timing between these events in some instances can be as short as a day and as long as several years, but the average timing is somewhere between 80 to 120 days.
That's amazing. That's really sobering statistics. And one, I'll come back. I've got just a little question because I was curious how the family sort of intersects with this. And I know we were going to talk about some other things, but I saw those networks. Maybe we can come back to it in Q&A. But as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, how does the family intersect with the neighborhood and with those connections? But getting back to Chicago, I mean, obviously Northwestern, we're situated in and around, in Evanston, Chicago area. And we're in the media daily, it seems, on some of these issues. Can you talk a little bit about your work with Chicago and with the city? Because I know you've been active in trying to develop those ties.
Yeah. So one of the hallmarks of N3 is that almost all of our scholarship and all of our research projects are engaged research, by which I mean we develop the research design, in some instances questions for interviews, we co-facilitate focus groups, and every bit of analysis that I've been showing you, we bring back to our partners. And in this case, our partners are nonprofit organizations, our partners are local violence prevention groups or City Hall or other governmental agencies, but we try to make sure that the questions we're asking are directly related to the problems we hope to help address, from our position at Northwestern, from our role as scholars. So we really try to ask these tough questions. I'm never at a shortage for scientific, interesting things to do with these data or projects, but we really try to make sure the core of these projects address some of these issues. And as a case in point, one of our key partners that I mentioned early on is Communities Partnering for Peace, CP4P. CP4P is a cluster of organizations. Now they're up to 15 or 16 neighborhoods, but when we started there were 9 that actually train and hire and work with people who have been most impacted by gun violence. People, formerly incarcerated individuals, formerly gang involved individuals, and they train them as frontline outreach workers who essentially try to go out and mediate disputes, who try to get individuals who are at high risk for gun violence to kind of go into services or relocation or substance abuse or housing. They're really frontline case managers. And this is actually an old practice in Chicago going back to the 1940s. It was popularized in the late 90s, early 2000s through efforts like Cure Violence. But it's a practice that's happening all around. And since 2016, 2017, these groups have come together across the city to kind of develop best practices, do trainings, and actually to try to reduce violence by inserting themselves in these networks. And so these individuals, and you can see some of them on your screen, some of the partner groups, they live in these networks. So when there's a shooting, they insert themselves in these networks to try to reach victims, reduce trauma, and to stop sort of retaliation. And one of the things we're trying to do, and we just got some funds from the Arnold Foundation to launch sort of a new project that's actually going to try to leverage the network information that you just saw, or that I just talked about, and get that into the hands of the outreach workers. So just as one illustration, here's that same sort of network in one Chicago neighborhood, the Back of the Yards community. And again, just like in all the other figures, you see these red dots, these victims clustered and clumped together. Our idea is to help use this information to say, hey, do we have outreach staff in this part of the network? Or how do we get to that part of the network? Because often where you're situated in your own networks, you can only see so far. So we're hoping and we're working to try to get this information to provide violence preventionists essentially a roadmap to their participants, to their communities, that can help them get them there more quickly to help, again, stop the spread of violence in much the way we hope to do with contact tracing and COVID, and also reduce the trauma associated with gun violence. And here's just one example from one of our participant organizations. You can see the red dots here are some of the victims again, but the larger dots are actually the participants. And you can see in this instance, and just an illustration, that there were about 6 gunshot victims in this little part of the network, 3 of whom were participants. And our idea is to continue to improve the reach of these sorts of organizations and help amplify essentially their impact.
Like everyone, I forget to unmute myself. We've got a couple of questions on the fly here that I think maybe you could handle, Andy. I think it would be helpful. Carlin Wilkins, is asking, does this account for innocent bystanders harmed in shootings?
That is a great question. So it actually does, but in different ways, which is most innocent bystanders are tragic, but not random, by which I mean, so there have been several high profile cases in Chicago of young children who were shot or killed this summer. In several of those instances, the intended target was a parent or a relative who was standing just a few feet away. And so while we don't necessarily see those innocent bystanders, what we do see is the intended target. And so in one particular case, there was, I think it was a 2-year-old who was in a car with a parent. The intended target of this it was a group involved shooting, was actually in the car directly behind, right? And they were related. And so they just shot the wrong car, or in many instances at a park where someone's having a barbecue or known to hang out, someone will open fire at a park. So those innocent victims might not be in here, but they're not that far removed, tragically so.
So there's another question here. In your research, how do you find out who someone's associates are? Do you ask gunshot victims with whom they would hang out? Are they interested in divulging that information?
So right now, and I apologize, I glossed over this for the sake of trying to get through some of these things. Right now, and what you're seeing here, we largely use official records, police records. We've currently started to expand this to use other public information. So we're partnering with Chapin Hall Center at the University of Chicago to look at things like TANF, to look at court records, to look at other information. So there was another question you asked earlier, Adrian. So we don't actually account for family information. So we're likely underestimating sort of people's networks. When we talk with individuals, so with our outreach partners, we bring these maps to them. And, as we bring these maps to them, oftentimes they'll start asking more information. And so recently, when I showed that back of the yards image to some of our outreach workers, an outreach worker was very quiet, clearly distraught after the whole event, came up to me afterwards and he said, one of those was my son who was shot. And we spent another hour and a half just talking about the things that were going on. And part of what we do, though we're talking about network science today at N3, is every single one of our projects has a qualitative or interview-based component where we're actually working with participants. We're actually spending a lot of time studying outreach workers themselves and the profession as it grows, because this has been one of the signature policies or ideas that people are trying to raise in this current moment as we're reimagining policing. And so we've been taking a really deep dive into the content of these networks and not just their structure. Though unfortunately, I didn't prepare any of that for today's talk.
So I think Jerry Ezrick and Elna Ezrick, I think that answered your question about how networks have been identified. If not, so resubmit the question, but I think that touched on it. There's a couple of questions about gangs. Mm-hmm. What does social network analysis tell us about gang violence interventions, which I suspect is its own social network in a way? And I think there was a second one about gangs. So just how do you define it? Are they defined by the network itself, or is there some formal way to identify what, I suppose, a gang is as a network?
So I'll answer the second question first. So what's interesting is one can easily define it as how police identify gang membership. What actually matters more, however, is how you're clumped up and clustered and tied to individuals. So actually, even if you're not tagged or labeled as a gang member by police, if you're in a really dense cluster, you have all the negative effects of it. So in fact, networks almost always trump official definitions. I will tell you though, gang membership is fluid, right? It's not an on and off switch. It's more like a dimmer switch. And so you might be part of a gang, at a certain time, and then you kind of stop hanging out, and then you hang out again. So it's much more fluid. And in fact, data often has a hard time capturing this fluidity of gang membership. What we find is that networks tell us more about the consequences in particular. To the first question around, what sort of interventions work, what we're finding and what we know, not just from this research, but other research, there's two different questions here. The short term, so how do we literally stop the bleeding today? And then there's long term, where the short term is concerned, things that focus on people, places, and behaviors, right? That can mitigate the sort of cascades that you saw. Those tend to have a short term effect. But they don't have a long-term effect because it's really hard to change networks. So if we think about just Chicago, but applies to any city, we built these networks 60 years ago, 120 years ago, by building expressways and housing projects and where school boundaries go and don't go and tax increment finance zones. Those things create the networks that we see. And to change networks, you have to change these bigger things. A lot of our research is focused on sort of the here and now, the immediate response, which is not to say we should not focus on the long term. They need to happen simultaneously as well. And a lot of this has to do with sort of who's in those networks at the same time.
So that's great. I mean, we've got a lot of questions coming in about this, but I'm going to take us back to the other major branch that you mentioned before of your research, which is police violence, which again is in the news day after day. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you've been doing with that?
So one of the things about bad behavior more generally is bad behavior is almost always group behavior. It's true of gang members, it's true of kids in school, it's also true sort of police. And I'm going to share my screen one more time, if you just bear with me. And one of the things that we've been doing is we've been working with another partner, just to kind of, again, highlight the work of our partnerships and how we approach it, known as the Invisible Institute. And if you're not familiar with the Invisible Institute, it's a great organization. They basically, through FOIA requests, released every Chicago police complaint from like 1980 to the present day. And they make this all publicly available. And if you go to their website, don't do it now during the Zoom talk, but perhaps when we're done, you can look up any particular information on any officer. And here's just one example. I've removed the officers' names, but this shows you that Officer A has had 36 complaint allegations, 12 of which were sustained. But on the bottom of this, what it shows you is it shows you who they've been co-accused with. So again, if Adrian and I were officers and someone said we had a use of force charge against us, we could see that Adrian and I were co-involved in this sort of behavior, which is exactly the same sort of construction of a network that I used in the other episode, other research on gun violence, which is if Adrian and I, if the civilian reports Adrian and I, right, we have a tie. We were at the very least in the same place and time and involved in the same behavior that was reported and recorded. You can hear some sirens. It's a fire truck, not a police truck going by. Sorry about that. But you can recreate these networks just like I did in the other instance. And when you do that, you see the same sorts of behaviors. And by the way, the sort of structures that you see, especially on the side that says civilian facing, every one of those dots is a Chicago police officer. And those ties, those connections are these bad behaviors among police officers, alleged bad behaviors, some sustained, and analytically we can cut through all of that. But what you see are small networks, isolated dots, one or two ties, and then you see one big network. Oftentimes when we talk about, bad apples, those are officers that have lots of complaints. What we don't know if all we think about are just the bad apples is that it's those sort of bad apples that create those larger networks. They're linking people together. And in one of our studies, which I won't talk about, it's those officers who link are also the same officers who are more likely to fire their weapon while they're on the job. And this is just one police district in the city. But what you can do for one police district, you can do for the entire city. And so what you're looking at here is essentially the misconduct network for the entire city of Chicago, about 4,600 officers. There are about 13,000, somewhere between 12,000 and 13,000 officers in the city of Chicago. And the cluster, the colors that you see, the different colors, are actually statistical clusters, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, of groups of officers that are doing bad things together, which we can identify. And the other thing that we've identified, just to kind of conclude this sort of part of the presentation, is that use of force is contagious. Much like we saw the victimization of gunshot injuries, the use of force, when officers are using force excessively, they learn that from their peers. And so in this study that came out in criminology and public policy, what we looked at was every individual officer in that network, ego, and we looked at their networks over time. And when people around them started to use force, they subsequently started to follow that behavior, right? And we saw a pretty severe effect, which is more exposure you had going from from 0 to 1, from 1 to 1.6, you see this increase, which is the more exposure, the more likely it is that you are likely to use force as well. We also found a very interesting mitigating effect, which is the percentage of your partners that were female. So it's a well-documented finding in criminology that female officers are less likely to use force, less likely to make false arrests, less likely to fire their weapons. And in fact, they're good to have in your network, which is they'll also mitigate male officers' use of force. And the last thing I'll say, which is one of the things we've been doing with one of the former undergraduate from Weinberg, who just graduated and is going on to bigger, better things than hanging out with just N3, we've started to look at statistical properties that help us predict which officers form crews and the disparate impact they can have, which is, just as an illustration, here was one of the cases that happened in Chicago, 19 people here, the sort of crew of officers that was linked to dozens and dozens of abuse cases, use of force cases that were essentially exonerated in the court of law. And so I'll stop sharing right there.
I really have to remind myself to unmute. We just had a question in that I think touched on some of the issues you were just raising in a very interesting way, and I thought I'd raise that first. Have you considered how race impacts networks within the police department and the community?
We have, and I'm happy to pass along any of our published work on this. The short answer is it's complex in complex ways. And so most of what looks like race effects, especially among Black officers, is often attributed to where they police, right? Which is more often than not, CPD will send Black officers to Black neighborhoods that tend to have higher crime rates, they have higher rates of complaints. And so oftentimes what looks like it might be racialized is actually an effect of where they're going in activity. I will say this, Black police officers in Chicago get fewer complaints than white officers, except from the department themselves. So when a fellow officer complains about a police officer, they're more likely to complain against the Black officer. So Black officers are receiving sort of workplace discrimination in CPD as well. Latino officers tend to look more like white officers in terms of their patterns, and there doesn't seem to be any major difference. There's also one other finding when you look at the race of the officer and the race of the community. Black neighborhoods tend to file more complaints, but the complaints of white civilians tend to be more likely to be sustained. And so there's another disparity about sort of the neighborhoods that are producing the complaints, which I think we're just beginning to understand.
So Nick, we've got a question here. Could you touch perhaps on the way in which COVID-19 has had an impact on gun violence in Chicago? Has there been, because it seems to have been, there was a sort of slowdown during the lockdown, but then it's come back into the news. And I'm just curious if there's any sort of statistical pattern to what's been going on.
So it's really important in the context of COVID, and I'm going to talk about this in two ways: what it's doing to crime more generally, but also what it's doing to violence prevention efforts. So when it comes to crime, there are certain types of crime that are down because COVID is kind of not conducive to it. So no one's going to break into your house if you're there. No one's going to steal your car if it's in your garage, right? So lots of crimes have gone down. Domestic instances of intimate partner violence have gone up, and they're very complicated because it's often hard to report it if you're in the home with the, say, person who's the abuser. Shootings and homicides have gone up. More specifically, though, they've gone up for a very short time period. We're still trying to understand why that's the case. Historically in this country, at every moment that you've had these surges, it's almost always related to cynicism or estrangement from the state. And that's a non-trivial moment of where we are in this country. But also because it's interpersonal conflict that drives most homicides, right? So most homicides are not drug deals gone wrong. They're about fights and disputes over status, over property, over romantic relationships. And one of the things that happens in COVID is those things get amped up because I know where you are. You're right down the block. I see you online. I know where you are. And so that's one of the things that may be driving it up. In criminological theory, we often call this routine activities, coming together in kind of time and space. which is really important. It's also had a big impact on the violence prevention workers, and we're about to release another research brief on CP4P and street outreach. The outreach staff that are out there, there are about 180 in the city of Chicago right now. And as gun violence increased, of course, their demand increases. But what happened is when COVID started, they became default frontline healthcare workers, handing out PPE. They started giving out food. They've been starting to help dispel rumors about COVID in neighborhoods, making sure people understood why they shouldn't, share cigarettes or glasses, or why they should wear masks and things like that. It's one of the things that they had to learn to do on the fly. And then we had the third wave of sort of unrest after the murder of George Floyd, which they were again trying to calm people down and kind of keep the neighborhood from experiencing more violence. So I think we've seen a massive shift on community organizations and actually extra burdens on what they had to do, which was unexpected on everybody's part, of course.
So here's a question from Freeman about why are you using use of force as your criteria for groupings? This is the police violence, rather than unjustified use of force, since that's what's characterized as bad behavior.
We actually use all of the above. And again, this is all in the paper. We have a sort of a funnel of layers of severity, from allegations to sustained to dismissed to led to a city payout. So there's a whole funnel that we look at it all. And the bottom line is they all correlate pretty heavily. So, the ones that, and by the way, it is important to say that most officers will only have a handful of complaints over their entire careers. And so this concentration that we see of excessive use of force, right, or sustained use of force, excessive use of force, which I think is a more important criteria, but they're almost all correlated with bad behavior more generally. Also, to be clear, we are not using use of force to create the networks. That's our dependent variable. What we're using to create the networks in this case are other allegations. So that we do kind of separate the two. We look at other bad behavior, say behind use of force or allegations, and then you'll use use of force as an outcome variable. The other thing I'll say is that just because something is not sustained does not mean it's not bad behavior. We know very little about why majority of these complaints are not sustained. And there are instances where, there's one high profile instance which was not sustained that had the DNA evidence of a suspect on the barrel of the officer's revolver, and that was dismissed. And we don't know why. We don't know what happened sort of in the deliberation process. And it still erodes the trust around policing. And so there are other things that we were looking at around policing, around procedural justice, around fairness that can help us understand these events, even if they're not sustained, and what damage they do to communities and policing.
There's quite a few questions here. There's one from Bob Shaw about, do you include locality data on the whole network or just on the individual? Does that speak to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do. We actually have a series of papers that connect the spaces. And so one of the things are, and this is why sociology is awesome. People change in these networks, but the neighborhoods stay the same. And what we've found is that the patterns of why neighborhoods are connected. Neighborhood A has been fighting with neighborhood B for 35, 40 years. And even though people move and change, that connection between places remains. And a lot of that has to do with these bigger issues. What schools do you go to? Where do your families live? And so we often, almost always include neighborhoods. And you can't have a city like Chicago or any city without talking about neighborhoods, and which gets confounded with race. Because of course, race and place in Chicago are quite similar, but we almost always look at neighborhood as well.
So I'm going to try and sum up a few questions here for the sake of time. There's a few cluster of questions from Austrian Waldron, Paul Lussau, Mary Hahn, that seek to sort of get at what are the ways, how does your research point to ways we might remediate? I mean, what are the, and I think you've pointed to some already through the neighborhood coalitions, et cetera. But for example, does your work help us inform anything on information about the source of guns? And is there any way to sort of get at the gun control debate through your research? And then Austin was asking about whether there's something about sort of almost the cycle of vendetta in a way between, between family members or group members about how they pursue a retaliation against others. Is there anything in your research that points to a way to sort of break that cycle?
Let me again start with the last question and come back to the gun issue. So quite frankly, what I think the research points to is ways to reach people who are in harm's way and experiencing trauma. And I actually believe, and I think this is what we're starting to see in some of our other work as well, is if you can reach those individuals, and street outreach provides a non-enforcement context to do that. And probably in 9 out of 10 cases, it's not law enforcement you want to send into those spaces immediately. It is the sort of violence interrupters, social workers, educators, preachers, teachers. I mean, they're already living in those networks. And so you can reach people in a way that is, not going to restrict freedoms or liberties or life. And you can do it quickly, in fact, if you can coordinate. And that's always the hard problem. We also know that rapid trauma response can reduce trauma, mitigate responses, and hopefully reduce retaliation. So the retaliation thing is real. And every morning our team is on a daily call with the outreach workers where they discuss every shooting that happened the night before. And they're planning for this and they're thinking about this. So we believe our research can help bolster those efforts.
Before you get to the
No.
gun issue, I wanted to add Mary Hahn's question about domestic violence, because it seems germane to what you were just saying. How, are they included in your statistics, and is that a special case when it comes to interventions like the one you're talking about?
It is a special case. In fact, the small percentage of cases that are missing from most of our studies are intimate partner violence. By the way, still a network, still about power. It's just a different network that doesn't often get captured. What we're seeing more and more through COVID, however, is the overlap. Even outreach is now understanding, because they're now in people's homes more than they are on the street. They're starting to have to experience this more. So we're learning fairly quickly about how important that is. I know we're almost out of time, but just 2 minutes on guns. We do have 2 big studies, one in Chicago, one in Boston, where we located every recovered firearm in the city inside these networks. And the important factor there is how close anyone is to a gun, which is any people that are in these networks, or they're shot or their friend is shot, they're about 2 handshakes away from a gun, which is a friend of a friend. So they might not have it themselves, but they know someone who does. Understanding the source of the guns, we're talking about in most cities where homicides are concerned or shootings are concerned, we're talking about illegal firearms, illegal handguns, by the way. And so it's a very particular type of firearm. I will say this just to and I'm happy if we've got any more time to keep going, but it has to be beyond local sorts of interventions. CPD recovers 7,000 to 10,000 guns a year, every year. I don't know what the denominator is, but if you can keep recovering that many guns, that means more guns keep coming in. And they're coming in from places like Indiana, which is a cash and carry state. They're coming in from Wisconsin. They're coming in from other states that have laxer laws. And so I think we have to think beyond just local ordinances. We have to think about state and actually federal things or regulations or restrictions or policies around firearms.
Thanks. That's really interesting. I wish we could go on, but we have to draw this to a close. The conversation can continue. I hopefully out there in the cyber universe, we can be in touch with one another. Andy, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who tuned in. We find these conversations to be really valuable. I love them. I hope you love them as well. I think they're really interesting to hear directly from our faculty what they're doing right now. It would be wrong of me not to mention that today is the last day of Northwestern's fiscal year 20. So to those of you who've made leadership gifts this year, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And if by chance you've not made a gift yet this fiscal year, please consider making today to help us support research like Dr. Papachristos's and others. I hope you're all well. I hope you are staying safe. And again, thank you to all of you. Thank you, Andy. And until next time.